She signs without looking at the face across from her. The paper trembles in her hand, not from fear, but from a steadier, older muscle memory of saying the truth out loud. The stamp falls with a dull, bureaucratic finality. The clerk's hand, the date, a thin line that will split two names on every public record from this day forward. Outside, a photographer blinks into a flash, and the headline writes itself on other people's timelines. CEO's wife files for divorce. The words have weight here: currency and scandal, rumor and balance sheet. For Ethan Liu, who has made his life out of leverage and optics, the headline lands like a mispriced asset. For Bella Shu, it is the safest, fiercest thing she has done in 5 years. She walks away from the Civil Affairs Bureau with a small leather folder, a single line of courage folded between her fingers. People glance, some stare. A woman drops a business card into her palm, unsolicited counsel from a divorce lawyer. A father in a suit holds a child and looks away. Bella breathes. She does not call Ethan. She does not wait for a text. She walks. Only when she reaches the curb does the voice inside her settle into a quiet she can respect. This was not a zealot's fury. It is the end of a ledger she can no longer balance. Love owed and not returned, dignity traded for silence, private betrayals dressed as public spectacle. She had rehearsed this alone for months, an exit strategy assembled in the margins of board meetings, in the pauses between late dinners where his phone lit up more often than his conversation did. The marriage had a name once: political alliance, upward trajectory, companionship that fit the contours of ambition. There had been a wedding under glass ceilings and champagne, an image the tabloids loved. There had been promises, and there had been raptures. Ethan with his hands on a steering wheel, Bella leaning forward, believing that someone who built an empire might also learn to hold a single heart. She leaves the past behind the bureau like a coat she no longer needs. Across town, in a building that used to feel like a temple to his name, Ethan Liu slams a file down on the boardroom table and watches stock tickers flicker toward ruin. His suit is unbuttoned. His jaw tightens as his executive assistant slides a tablet toward him. Market reaction, the usual morning carnage multiplied into a public relations problem. The board murmurs. A younger director says the word liability like a verdict. Ethan hears marriage in the same breath, and the world narrows. He had always believed money could fix misalignment. It had fixed the corporate merger when his competitors laughed. It had bought silence at times. It had ensured a facade of a life. He had not predicted that the one ledger he couldn't bolt would be the human one. He had not expected she would use the law to separate lines. In his mind, the moment she signed glowed like an error on a screen. Furious adrenaline fights with a slower, colder despair. Regret arrives not as a movie trope, but as evidence. The calls he missed, the nights he chose expansion over apology, the one-off intimacies that left permanent emptiness. He thinks of Sandy Sue. Her name passed like an accusation in boardroom whispers. He thinks of the videos, the rumors, the photos that don't show much but show enough. He thinks, with a clarity that scares him, that he never once tried to learn how to keep her. He stands up. He is a man trained to move, to control, to purchase outcomes. He decides, not for the first time, to make the crisis an investment. That afternoon, Bella calls a former colleague and says, "I need a stage." She will audition for a televised talent showcase that weekend. Call it a reckless thing or a theatrical reclaiming of her voice. It is not about fame. It is about being seen as someone who acts, not who is acted on. The idea keeps her awake at night. To stand alone under lights and be measured by talent rather than lineage. If she passes, it will be a small, defiant repair, a paycheck, a platform, a proof. The audition room is sticky with nerves, buzzing with hopefuls, and smelling faintly of cheap perfume and ambition. She stands in half-light with a sheet of lyrics in her hand and a breath that belongs to her. Men in the waiting room whisper trade names and investments. A man with a practiced charm offers a photograph, then a number. Another speaks in the polished cadence of a businessman using women as a line item. Alan Yan watches from the periphery. Sharp suit, predator smirk. Sizing her not as a woman but as a transaction. He approaches after her turn, a wolf with invitations veiled as compliments. "You have a presence," he says. "You know what could open doors for someone like you." It is the tone she recognizes from the time she had to sell a smile at social banquets. A reward for compliance and an entitlement to access. Bella is polite. She refuses. He laughs too loudly and tells her there is no shame in being practical. She walks out with silence as her shield. Back at Triumphal Holdings headquarters, Ethan's panic becomes action. He summons Hank Chin, faithful, willing, an assistant turned fixer who does not flinch at the edges of ethical gray. "Contain it," Ethan says, voice low enough that the wood-paneled room doesn't carry his shame. "No leaks. Quiet the narrative. Sandy Sue, get whatever we need." Hank nods and disappears into a grid of texts and phone calls. He schedules a meeting with a publicist, orders discreet surveillance, and pulls a small ledger out of a locked drawer. A list of payments, favors, and favors converted into proof. It is the sort of thing built over years by men who think money equates to control. Ethan looks at the list as if it were another campaign map, at once necessary and loathsome. He makes a decision he will regret, but will frame as decisive. He will not only try to stop the divorce.
He will stage an extraordinary gesture, a symbolic ransom for the loss he now fears, a show of value that both buys time and attracts the world's gaze. He imagines a necklace, spectacular, blinding, impossible. He sees the headlines already. CEO tries to buy back wife with $100 million necklace. The idea is bold and ruinous, and exactly the kind of risk he takes for market share. He convinces himself that if he can manufacture the spectacle and the sincerity around it, he can influence public opinion, the board, and, most importantly, Bella. But inside him there is more than strategizing. There is a tremor of the man who, as a child, watched his grandfather's approval mean everything. There has been a genealogy of empire building that equated personal worth with conquest. In those hushed wires between decision and action, he feels the first true shame of a man who realizes he cannot buy the one thing that matters. Meanwhile, Bella's phone vibrates with messages she ignores. Her mother texts unfamiliar admonitions, her sister pleads for composure, a lawyer leaves a message about potential alimony. People try to be helpful by applying their own values, advice and guilt mixed together. Bella's solidarity comes in fragments. An older neighbor brings soup, a friend gives her a tired smile and a place to rest. The world she moves through oscillates between the kind gestures of strangers and the invasive curiosity of strangers with cameras. There is, too, the darker lover of her life, John Liu. He is Bella's father and a cavity in the family's history. Convicted, incarcerated, and still dangerous in ways that money cannot erase. The father who raised her in a house that learned to speak in double meanings, truths shaded by necessity, has always been a man who treats people as instruments. He has sent letters from prison. He has offered counsel that feels like a strategically misdirected map. When her mother died, he sent a single photograph and a confession. When he was released, he stepped into the role of manipulator once again. The hospital call comes on a Sunday morning. Bella races to the ward with words too short for the space. The handset's tone harmonizes with a sound she has learned to listen to. Monitors beep like Morse code for life. John lies pale under fluorescent lights, more fragile than the crimes attributed to him. Doctors say he will be conscious for a short time. They do not say when any chance for restitution can become redemption. Bella sits on the vinyl chair and remembers the worst and the best of him. the small acts of irony that had once seemed like love. The man speaks in a voice that has lost its ability to wound, and it surprises her. "You were always harder to buy," he says, the sentence a rebuke and a benediction in one breath. He coughs. "Don't let them make you small." She wants to believe it is repentance. She also wants, with a clearer edge, to ask him if any of this, his network, his debts, his enemies, will fall on her.
"Did you sign for anything?" she asks, practical and dry. He coughs again and manages a half smile, the kind that says, everything always belonged to someone else. When the monitors stop, the room clarifies. His death will require paperwork, proof, and, in the months to come, an aftermath that smells of legal fees and whispered manipulations. Already, the hospital ward's murmurs drift toward how his name connects to an old case. Misdirected funds, an offshore ghost company, a ledger with holes. Small clues float to Bella like feathers. A phone number on his last note, a bank statement that doesn't add up. She leaves the hospital with more questions, and a thin envelope a nurse slipped into her palm. His last letter, shaken but legible. She reads only a line aloud to herself in the taxi, the city rushing past like a film. "If they come for the family, don't let them find you defenseless." It is both a threat and a plea. She tucks the envelope into her jacket like a talisman, and wonders what lines of debt or vindication will intersect with her own life now that she is alone. Ethan is watching the same city's screens with fewer philosophies about love and more about appetite. He calls his brother, Edward, a quieter man, less flashy, and the sort who listens to the parts of the empire that the public doesn't see. Edward has always been the ballast to Ethan's engine. He answers with measured words that pretend at calm. "You don't need a spectacle," Edward says. "It isn't for the public," Ethan replies too quickly. "It's for her." Edward pauses. He knows something Ethan is only beginning to see. Gestures can be legerdemain. They can change the angle of a photograph. They cannot amend a life. But he also knows the practicalities, the board, the stock, the lawsuits. He reluctantly offers to look into provenance. "Be discreet," he says, as if there were ever such a thing in a family that trades in headlines. Sandy Sue watches from a distance in the way people who have been cast as villains watch for openings. She sits in a bar with friends who talk too loudly about scandals. Her pregnancy rumor is the sort that begins as a whisper and becomes a weapon. The media loves a triangle. The market punishes distraction. Sandy knows how to play both sides. She smiles with a practiced nonchalance and takes calls from men who think they own access. There is a loneliness to the way she moves through rooms, beautiful, contained, full of accountings. At Bella's audition, the judges give a curt round of evaluations. They are not cruel. They are a machine. Bella does not win the slot she had hoped for. She loses with dignity, and the cameras do not catch the way her hands tremble when she leaves the stage. Instead, she finds a small audience member who offers her a card. "You were brave up there. If you ever want better shows, call me." It is consolation and a line out of anonymity alike. The tabloids, however, prefer a narrative that folds neatly into gossip. They publish photographs of Ethan in questionable contexts from years prior. A picture of a handshake in a restaurant, an image of Sandy Sue laughing with someone from the board. They imply, softly and then loudly, that Bella's public humiliation explains everything. The company's stock decreases a few percent in an early small stampede. Analysts tweet about governance and distraction. Everything feels precarious, like an unsteady tower of goods waiting for a small shove. Ethan sends a small gift after the headlines, nothing close to what he later imagines, but expensive enough to make the point. A necklace arrives at Bella's mother's apartment with a note, "Forgive me, I am trying." The tag reads, $2 million. It is both an apology and a ledger entry. Bella throws the box into a drawer with a sound that is less dramatic than moral.
Money was never the currency of her refusal. She calls Edward, not because she trusts the family, she does not, but because he had once acted to stop a rumor that would have ruined her father. "I don't want anything from them," she says. "I just want my name to belong to me." Edward listens. He offers a practical suggestion: legal counsel, a small PR team that will not pander to the tabloids, and, if she wants, a seat at a meeting that will explain the financial strings in a way no newspaper headline can. He is protective in a way that doesn't insist on control. He shows up at her door twice with a briefcase of dry facts and offers to walk her through threats that might arise, contractual penalty clauses she never noticed, non-disclosure agreements that might be weaponized against her. He is a map maker who believes her agency must be preserved. There are also absurdities that puncture the tension. Ethan, in a misguided attempt to learn humility and how to be less like a CEO and more like a husband, enrolls in a class a friend recommends, a weekend seminar with speakers and exercises designed to teach men emotional labor. The flyer reads, "Male Virtue Academy," and it is ridiculous in a way that is honest. The class requires him to write a letter of vulnerability and to practice listening without interrupting. His attempts are awkward but not meaningless. He stands in a circle with other men who have started to see the edges of their own assumptions and tries, haltingly, to stand in the shoes of the people they love. Hank watches him try and feels a strange sympathy. The academy is stagecraft, shared vulnerability as performance, but for Ethan it becomes a mirror. On the last day of the course, an instructor asks him to imagine his worst failure and then the steps he will take to repair it. Ethan's list is a catalog of transactions at first. Then, slowly, it becomes less about purchases and more about accountability. He leaves the academy with his pride bruised and a conviction that something both theatrical and sincere can be combined to extraordinary effect. The board calls an emergency meeting.
Triumphal's lawyers warn about reputational damage. The PR team draws up containment strategies. Some directors see the divorce as a risk to institutional confidence. Others smell an opportunity to push Ethan out if his missteps are too costly. His grandfather, who built the conglomerate from scratch and now sits in a study that smells of pipe tobacco and old paper, calls him to the house. He is a man who measures the family like a ledger and expects obedience. "Do not let one impertinence become the company's downfall," he says, with a precision that freezes in the marrow. Ethan goes home that night to a suite that once felt like sanctuary and finds silence instead. He touches the wall where a photograph of their wedding hangs, his hand uncertain. He does not know whether he wants to beg, to buy, to manipulate, or to atone. He drafts messages he will not send. He rehearses apologies that sound hollow in the echo chamber of the bedroom. He thinks about the necklace again and feels a thin, electric certainty that the world will respond to spectacle. Bella spends her evenings in a small apartment with a pot of tea and a ledger of her own. Bills, legal notices, and the receipts of small choices she makes to stay afloat. She returns calls and declines offers that come wrapped in pity. She goes to meetings where men attempt to measure her worth by network and influence, and she says no to a late-night proposition and walks away with her dignity intact. But the threats do not remain abstract. An anonymous envelope arrives at her mother's apartment with photographs and a single sentence printed on a yellowed receipt. "Your father knew too much." It is a threat and an invitation. Bella files the envelope under evidence, because in the months to come she will learn the slow, unromantic truth about survival, that facts are sometimes all you have, and the truth can be the only currency you can spend without cost. One night, the tabloids run a piece on Sandy Sue's alleged pregnancy. Overnight, her life becomes a tinderbox. Rumors cascade in, and Ethan's name is linked by innuendo. The boardroom pressure grows. Investors ask hard questions. The market's fickle appetite turns. Ethan is in the vortex, and the idea of a grand gesture begins to morph from an impulse into a strategy. He calls his contacts in the luxury houses, he asks for provenance, he calculates tax consequences and legalities. There must be a paper trail, legitimate purchase, personal ownership, nothing suggesting misuse of company funds. He will do everything in the right order because he believes order will solve chaos. But actions are not born in a vacuum. In the undercurrent of financial maneuvering, a different current moves. Someone else, a man who has been watching for his own opportunity, perceives weakness. Alan Yan reaches for influence, offering resources and deals under the table. He meets with a middleman who knows how to use gossip as leverage. The man promises to stabilize Ethan's problem for a price. Ethan hears the offer and recoils. He knows the language of deals that come at the cost of another person's agency. Bella meets with a lawyer who sketches out options: custody, if there is to be a child, media strategy, and the refusal to be weaponized by people who profit from scandal. The lawyer is direct. Whatever you accept, you determine the terms. Do not let gifts be leverage. Do not let repentance be transactional. Bella repeats this phrase like an invocation. She trains herself to see how gestures can be converted into cages. Days blur into a cadence of attacks and defenses. A leaked audio file from a private dinner circulates. The content is ambiguous, a mosaic that the press stitches into clear betrayal. The company's name dips another %. Ethan starts to consider that his family legacy, his power, might depend on whether he can remake this narrative. One afternoon, a tax investigator calls Bella, an offhand procedural thing about her late father's accounts. In the same breath, a junior associate at Triumphal leaks a confidential memo connecting an offshore account to a name associated with John Liu. The investigation threads begin to knuckle in, and to Bella it begins to feel like the truth might emerge if someone finds the right ledger. Edward appears in her life with an offer of quiet support, a private investigator, and a list of accounts to check. He insists it be done legally. He seems to understand that the only leverage she can rightfully wield is information. If they think they can scare you into silence, he says, then let them see what they can't hide. A quiet montage unfolds. Late nights at law offices, files photocopied under the hum of fluorescent lights, a search for receipts and wire transfers that look like ghosts. Bella learns to ask for things she once would have accepted as gifts: a relevant bank statement, a signed contract, a witness contact. She files her own narrative into the public record, an affidavit about the emotional abandonment she suffered, signed with a hand that does not tremble. Ethan watches this work like a man watching a small insurgency. His instincts tell him to buy the narrative back, to buy silence, or to buy headlines that frame him not as negligent but as penitent. Hank delivers a confidential note. There is interest in a private showing. It will be expensive. It will be public enough to push the conversation away from the company and onto the man. He imagines the scene: the necklace in a velvet box, cameras trained like a flock of birds, Bella opening it in a public square, the world deciding for her what the story will be. He imagines cameras catching the moment she accepts and the stock lifting in response. He imagines the apology in a headline, and he imagines forgiveness following the sparkle. But there is also a small, darker detail Ethan cannot unsee: the possibility that the gesture will be read as bribery. There are legal implications if he uses company funds, and a public relations team that can manage nuance is required. He begins to separate the problems into columns: financial, legal, personal. For every ethical concern, he lists a counterargument. He will fund it personally, he says. He will show a chain of purchases. He will avoid the trap of buying affection by making the purchase alone and making the act about sacrifice rather than purchase. He begins the procurement process with a cold, meticulous joy, the same sensation he feels when closing a hostile acquisition. He calls jewelers, private collectors, brokers who know how to move things that cannot be explained. He asks for the provenance, for proof, for an unassailable chain of custody. He wants the world to see both the extravagance and the legitimacy. Bella, for her part, is learning to see gifts differently. She refuses the 2 million necklace. She leaves it on a table in a room of her mother's apartment and asks the lawyer to return it. She writes a terse note, "Not now, not this way." The gesture does not move her. If anything, it clarifies what she will not become. At a private brunch, Ethan meets with his grandfather and a bored elder. He frames the plan, to stage a gesture that will reframe the conversation. "Make it a statement," he says, choosing his words as if he were negotiating a merger. "Make it about value, about respect. The optics must kill the rumor." His grandfather listens with an expression halfway between approval and disdain. He tells Ethan to decide quickly because markets are impatient. The air grows taut. There are small skirmishes, a pugilistic op-ed, a threatened lawsuit from a media house, a clandestine meeting with a man who offers to handle the tabloids. Ethan says no to that last part because he has a principle, and because, perhaps, somewhere beneath vanity and panic, he might not want to use dark art to reclaim what he lost. He does not yet know whether he can reconcile his desire for control with the kind of repentance that is not theatrical. At night, when he can no longer think in categories of strategy, he conjures a memory of Bella laughing in a kitchen that was never theirs, a small, private domesticity he has neglected, a joke about coffee spoons that had nothing to do with mergers. The memory is not enough to change the past, but it is enough to change the calculus of his desperation. Bella, meanwhile, is navigating a world that calls itself public and private at once. She answers questions from friends and strangers alike. She sits through interviews where the hosts smile and reposition her as a cautionary tale. She takes calls from a woman named Amy, who runs a small agency and offers her a managerial contract for a boutique show. The money is modest, but it is untainted by expectations. The offer is a lifeline and a way to reclaim small, durable authority in a life that had been defined by someone else's ledger. He signs paperwork that will allow him to claim the purchase is separate, even at the cost of naming his personal accounts as collateral. Hank, meanwhile, begins to orchestrate the public relations narrative, how to stage the reveal so it looks spontaneous, how to keep the cameras at bay until the script is ready. He tasks a photographer to scout lighting and to imagine a moment that will overshadow every rumor. The choreography tastes like theater, a walk across a stage, an open box, the flash of diamonds. It is a transaction that will also be performance art. But the more Ethan arranges, the more complicated the world becomes. Edward quietly meets with investigators who are tracing the offshore accounts connected to John Liu. They find gaps, small, deliberate absences in the record where money changed names like slips of paper. Someone had been siphoning small sums through shell corporations. The trail suggests that John Liu had been involved in more than one scheme, and that some of those schemes intersected with Triumphal's previous acquisitions. Bella receives an anonymous call. "We have information about your father's accounts," a voice says. "If you want it, you meet in person." She is wary. She refuses solicitations that smell of leverage. She asks Edward to send someone to sit in the coffee shop across the street. She wants proof before she goes. Still, curiosity gnaws. She is careful, now more than before. At Triumphal, a junior auditor discovers a memo that would be innocuous if it were not tied to a name that keeps surfacing in Bella's father's files. The auditor's boss flags it. The company's internal compliance team butterflies into motion. It is small, mundane work, but bureaucracies, like slow landslides, can topple empires if they find the right pebble. Sandy Sue, caught between rumor and reality, makes her own choices. She announces a pregnancy test result privately to a friend and then to a doctor. The narrative she had feared becomes a knot of decisions. She considers naming Ethan, and she does not.
She calculates the costs of scandal against the costs of silence. There is a loneliness to her decision-making that outsiders will never understand. Sandy is no simple villain. She is, in her own way, a woman trying to place herself on a map that rarely made room for her. One night, after a round of closed-door strategy meetings, Ethan goes to the jeweler's private salon. The piece they show him is ridiculous, the price worse than obscene, and the weight of it heavy in a way that shifts the air. It is composed of a string of diamonds larger than any he has ever seen, arranged like a collar stolen from the necks of empires. The proprietor says it belonged to a collector who lost everything in Basel. He wanted it to go to someone who would make it part of history. Ethan listens like a man receiving a blessing. He imagines the moment. Bella surprised, startled, speechless. Forgiveness, he thinks.
Yet, as he signs, the watchful world tightens. A small, patient investigator hired by Edward calls to say that a bank in Jersey has reopened an old account with transfers that line up with dates John Liu was in need. This is not a coincidence, the investigator says. Someone has been laundering small amounts under many names. We think it ties to an old scheme. The jewelry purchase will make a paper trail. Even if Ethan insists it is personal, the money must come from somewhere, and money leaves tracks. The more he moves, the more likely the investigators are to find a path that intersects with the very ledger he hoped would remain separate from scandal. At Bella's modest apartment, her mailbox is less a receptacle for bills and more a litany of claims and offers. She reads a threatening email from an anonymous sender with a photograph of a hand delivering an envelope on her mother's doormat. It is as if someone wants to draw her back into vulnerability by telling her she is never safe. She calls the number on the harassing message and gets silence. She files complaints. She breathes and refuses to be shaped into fear. Edward's investigator discovers a small break in the chain. An accountant used to move money between companies had once been a subcontractor on a triumphal acquisition. His name shows up alongside an address that connects to a safe deposit box. The boxes are rarely empty. The team arranges, quietly, to subpoena and to map the network. Once a pattern forms, it can be shown. Ethan, on the other hand, begins to feel a strange inversion of his confidence. The necklace is soon to arrive via secure courier, and he arranges a private showing at a place that is both intimate and public, a charity gala where cameras will be present, socialites will gasp, and the world will watch the man who offers the weight of his repentance in diamonds. But even as he plans spectacle, his calendar fills with more urgent, dampening meetings. Lawyers insisting that the gift be given in a way that avoids perception of bribery. Auditors asking for proof that the funds are personal. Regulators requesting a list of transactions. His grandfather's voice returns in his head like a metronome. "Remember that there are things you cannot buy," he had said. Ethan wonders if right now he is trying to buy himself the one thing his family always expected him to manage: control. Bella's world is quieter in these days, but not simpler. She follows threads that might unravel the people who think they can own her by proxy. She sits with her father's old letters and traces names like a child tracing constellations. Each name is a star that might lead to an explanation of why the men she loved could be so careless. Each name, she knows, might also expose her to new forms of leverage. She does not want a martyr's story. She wants a map that will show where to step next. One night, a courier slips off Ethan's private jet with the velvet box. The chain of custody is airtight. The photos that will later circulate are staged in a gilded room with crystal chandeliers and a white tablecloth. The necklace lies in a box like a confession. Ethan holds it with a tenderness he has not shown since early in their marriage. The hand that once held blueprints now holds shimmer and regret. He imagines the world pressing into the moment like an audience expecting a miracle. He convinces himself that spectacle can be converted into sincerity, that light can be shaped into remorse. He thinks of Bella's refusal of the 2 million necklace and studies her face in memory, so steady, so controlled, and decides that, if anything will surprise her, it will be something impossible enough to force acknowledgement. But impossible things have consequences. The necklace will attract attention beyond headlines. Investigators will watch for records. Lawyers will parse ownership. And the man who had stolen small sums for security will find his discretion threatened by the sudden influx for scrutiny. The very act of spectacle begins to serve as a magnet for the truths someone has tried to bury. At the end of part 1, Ethan goes to his grandfather's study with a velvet box in a brown paper bag, an ugly, small thing against the monumental heirloom it contains. He places it on the desk between old ledgers and family portraits and says, "If I make this offer, can we buy back the narrative?" His grandfather looks at the box without sentiment. "Narratives are fragile, boy," he says. "They bend to the will of those who tell them. But remember, apology is not an asset, it is a responsibility. If you hand over this box and expect absolution, you are inviting many others to write the terms of your redemption." Ethan hears that and feels the tip of panic in his chest. He knows it will not be enough. And yet, in the way men do when cornered by their own choices, he decides to move forward. He has a plan, the gift, the public reveal, the staged moment that would, he hopes, tilt both public and private toward him. Across the city, Bella opens a desk drawer and finds the 2 million necklace wrapped in tissue paper, returned by couriers with a note from the jeweler. "Purchased by Mr. Ethan Liu. Return requested." She breathes in the metallic scent of obligations and tosses the tissue aside. The necklace does not shine for her. It clinks like a cymbal. A text comes in from an unknown number. "Meet me tomorrow. There will be information about your father's accounts. Bring nothing." She considers the note the way a woman considers a step across a cracked bridge, necessary perhaps, but not without danger. She prepares by calling Edward and arranging for him to have eyes nearby. She will meet not to be trapped, but to gather data. The stage is set. The players are moving. Gifts and ledgers, headlines and hollow apologies are all in motion. The necklace is bought. The plan is moving from idea to action. Across the city, Bella opens a desk drawer and finds the 2 million necklace wrapped in tissue paper, returned by couriers with a note from the jeweler. "Purchased by Mr. Ethan Liu. Return requested." She breathes in the metallic scent of obligations and tosses the tissue aside. The necklace does not shine for her. It clinks like a cymbal. A text comes in from an unknown number. "Meet me tomorrow. There will be information about your father's accounts. Bring nothing." She considers the note the way a woman considers a step across a cracked bridge, necessary perhaps, but not without danger. She prepares by calling Edward and arranging for him to have eyes nearby. She will meet not to be trapped, but to gather data. The stage is set. The players are moving. Gifts and ledgers, headlines and hollow apologies are all in motion. The necklace is bought. The plan is moving from idea to action. The threats converge like currents under the city. Something large is about to be revealed, and neither side will leave unscarred. The stranger's note had been the last thing Bella expected that morning. A plain envelope, no return address, the single line she had been living inside for weeks. "Meet me tomorrow. There will be information about your father's accounts. Bring nothing." She had almost dismissed it until Edward's investigator called with a name, Mei Chen, once an accountant at a shadowed holding company, now living quietly across town. The investigator said Mei had been cautious but curious. Curiosity was how secrets became inconvenient truths. They agreed to meet at a corner cafe that smelled of burnt coffee and oranges. Bella arrived early, hands folded around a paper cup so she wouldn't fidget. Edward sat 2 tables over, his expression practiced neutrality. The investigator sat further back, pretending to read a newspaper. Mei Chen arrived with careful steps, a folder tucked to her chest like an apology. "I wasn't supposed to keep anything," she said without preamble. Her voice had the texture of someone who had held back tears for years. She placed a thumb drive on the table and slid it toward Bella. "But I kept copies. For myself, then for my conscience. There were transfers, small ones, months apart. They were always described as consulting, fees, things that sounded legitimate." She swallowed. They weren't for services. They were payoffs. Bella felt the air shift in that moment, like a secret drawing breath. The folder smelled faintly of old paper and coffee. The USB felt weightless and enormous. "What names?" Bella asked. May hesitated, as if the damage of language had to be measured. John Liu's name appears in memorandum references. There are shell companies, short strings of transfers to accounts that then route money to him indirectly. There are also entries referencing the name A.Y., Alan Yan. Edward's silence was a pressure that could have been a verdict. "Do you have proof?" he asked. Mei Chen's jaw tightened. "I have internal memos. I have account logs with IP addresses and transaction IDs. I kept copies because something told me these wouldn't be harmless forever." She looked at Bella. "I thought the right thing was to give this to law enforcement. But when I first tried, someone convinced me to wait. They said I was making a mistake. I almost threw it away. Then Mr. Liu's men paid a visit, quietly. They said I should be careful with what I knew." Bella's hands closed around the cup until the cardboard creaked. The words landed like small stones. Evidence, threat, history. It was a ledger of complicity, not merely a list of numbers. She thought of her father and the last sentence he had written. "If they come for the family, don't let them find you defenseless." She had not understood its full gravity until now. Edward's investigator had already prepared contingencies.
"We get this to a prosecutor," he said. "We will not make a move in public until we can protect the witness. May will come with us. We'll get warrants, subpoenas, and we will need to time anything Ethan does, especially if he has a plan to stage a spectacle." The word spectacle sat between them like a warning. Bella felt the urge to warn them in return. Be careful. This would bring cameras. Spectacle would attract predators. May nodded and pushed the thumb drive across again, as if testing its reality. Bella slid it into her bag and felt its weight in a way that was not physical. They moved quickly after that. Edward arranged a meeting with a conscientious prosecutor who had a reputation for following money where it wanted to disappear. The prosecutor was a woman with a courtroom patience and a small list of wins. She listened and then leaned forward. "If your documentation shows transfers to shell companies that then route to John Liu and align with dates we can tie to commission events," she said, "we can move. But we will need to demonstrate intent, and we will need witnesses who will testify under oath." May agreed to cooperate. She signed an affidavit in an office that smelled of lemon disinfectant and old carpet, her small signature a defiant ledger entry. She would produce IP records and an email chain that tied a mid-level accountant at Triumphal to the wire transfers. The prosecutor promised subpoenas. The coffee in that office tasted like proof. Meanwhile, Ethan moved with the metallic grace of a man who had rehearsed crisis. The necklace was scheduled to arrive by private courier in 48 hours. The charity gala he had chosen was a familiar arena. High ceilings, a sea of faces who owed him favors and looked to him for cues. He wanted the moment to be about contrition and value, to make the world see an apology that was also a sacrifice. He told himself over and over that if words had failed, light might not. Hank tightened the choreography.
He booked the room adjacent to the ballroom for a private reveal and arranged for a media-friendly entrance. A short speech, a presentation, cameras angled to capture the moment of Bella's surprise. "We control what goes out," Hank told him. Hank's loyalty had been carved through years of favors and proximity. But Hank also felt, in the bottom of his chest, the unease of someone watching a friend gamble with something that could not be replaced by money. Edward, who had access to internal memos Triumphal had never meant to be seen by the public, quietly put pressure on the board's compliance director. He said he wanted the company to cooperate with any legitimate inquiry. "If it's your family, then protect the company by being transparent," he said. His words had an effect because they came from a family muscle no one else could move. Ethan, in private, read and reread a short list he had written 3 times and then rewritten until the sentences meant more than performance. "I will apologize publicly and take responsibility for the failures that led to her pain," he had written. "I will fund a restitution and an independent audit of any implicated accounts. I will step down if necessary." He had tried to make the list sincere because sincerity had to be shown, not only spoken. But the idea of stepping down frightened him with a new, vivid terror. The sense that his identity would fracture if it was not whatever his name guaranteed. At Triumphal's in-house auditor's desk, a young employee named Lee Jun, whose office had always been a shrine to spreadsheets, stumbled across a flagged transaction that did not fit the normal contours of the company's acquisitions. This was not a thrilling discovery, but it had clarity. The transfer code matched one of Mei Chen's entries. Lee Jun, careful and nervous, took it to his boss. The compliance team moved like a wary organism. They secured records, froze a suspect account pending legal review, and drafted a notice that would be delivered only when law enforcement allowed. When the prosecutor's office served subpoenas, Triumphal complied under pressure, producing months of records that began stitching together a pattern no one could easily dismiss. Alan Yan, sensing danger, as men who traffic in rumors do, made a clumsy maneuver that would prove his undoing. He tried to pressure a supplier into silence with a threat that was recorded, either by hubris or bad judgment. The supplier, fearing for his own position, took a copy of the conversation to the prosecutor. The recording was not cinematic. It was petty and sharp. But petty things have a way of unraveling bigger ones when they're pulled at the right seam. Days folded into one another. The private investigator found more receipts. A shell corporation's director had neglected to change an email password and left a thread that named an intermediary. The story that had been gossip in tabloid columns began to look like an audit trail in a prosecutor's binder. Each time Bella read a new document, her rage and her calm refined themselves into something practical. This was not revenge, she told herself. This was accountability. The night of the gala dawned with a brittle, false light. Staff moved like actors rehearsing a tragedy. Ethan's chest felt heavy. He kept rehearsing apologies in the mirror, watching his mouth shape the phrases that had been chosen by people who wanted to both save a man and avert a scandal. He arrived early, the velvet box hidden beneath his coat like an accusation. Bella had been invited, of course. It was a calculated choice. Invitation in the name of reconciliation, a chance to keep the moment within reach. She had accepted only on conditions. She would sit in the back row, accompanied by her lawyer and Edward. She refused guest lists full of pressure and proximity. She wanted to be present on her terms. The gala room was a theater of soft lights and glinting glass. It smelled of perfume and citrus. The orchestra's strings thrummed like restrained electricity. Cameras were there, discreet and hungry. The charity whose name danced on the program was noble, and that nobility was part of the calculation. People rarely turned down a cause when a man with a name and capital asked them to be seen supporting it. When Ethan took the stage, the air tightened. He spoke with the practiced authority of a man who had negotiated against other people's emotions his entire life. He said the words, about regret, about learning, about taking responsibility. The audience drank what he offered, some with genuine surprise, others with the polite distance of those who knew public apologies could be statements of self-preservation. Then he stepped aside, and a spotlight revealed the box. He asked Bella to join him because he wanted the authenticity of her presence, because, he told himself, the optics of her acceptance would be the proof the world demanded. Bella walked slowly. Her lawyer whispered the rules. They would not be pressured in that room. She had not expected the vertigo of being lit with 300 strangers' attention, nor the smaller, sharper gaze of a man who had once made her world equal to his own. Ethan lifted the lid. The necklace lay there like a constellation that had been condensed into metal and cut stone. It was obscene in scale, necklace and collar at once, draped like a crown that offered no sovereignty. Cameras flashed. For a second, the world shrank to light and weight. The audience inhaled, as if a new narrative would fit that moment. Ethan's voice trembled, unintentionally honest. "This is for you," he said. "I know it cannot unwrite years of neglect. It cannot undo what I failed to do. But I want you to have it, if you accept it." Bella looked at the stones, and then at him. The question between them could not be answered by diamonds. She felt their cold surface, like a mirror. She recognized the spectacle for what it was, a performance designed to rewrite headlines. But she also recognized the possibility that public moments could be harnessed for accountability, in the right hands. She spoke, and every word was measured. "I will not be bought," she said clearly, voice cutting through the orchestra's hush. "And I will not be your apology on demand." She could hear microphones clamp closer like birds. "But I have evidence that ties certain payments to shell accounts. There are people who will answer for what they did." Her lawyer nudged her, but she continued. "If you want me to accept this, it will not be as a symbol of silence. It will be the beginning of repair." A murmur ran through the room, the particular hum that tells a man he is no longer in control of the story. Ethan felt the ground shift. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, a man finally asking more than he was narrating. Bella's list was not a plea. It was a set of terms, a contract as much moral as legal. "Public confession of the failures that led to this scandal," she said. "A commitment to fund a restitution and an independent audit that is overseen by a third party. You will step down from any position that allows you to interfere with that audit. You will not use this necklace or any other gift to influence the outcome. You will give authority to a neutral compliance board. And you will make a public commitment to funding programs that protect people who have been used, silenced, or coerced." Her words landed like edicts. Ethan's face moved through stages he had not rehearsed. Shock, shame, calculation, then surrender. The necklace in the box flashed like a false promise. He pressed his palms together as if to keep something from spilling from his hands. At that moment, the prosecutor's team made their move, not to interrupt the gala, but to enforce the law. They had timed their entrance to avoid spectacle, but events had their own logic. Agents from the prosecutor's office entered the ballroom with quiet insistence and presented subpoenas to Triumphal's legal counsel. A compliance director, pale, took the papers and read them like a verdict. Across the room, a man who had been quietly watching, the supplier who had recorded Alan Yan's threats, strolled to the media table with a copy of the recording. A journalist, sensing the angle, played the clip. Alan's voice, recorded in the raw, sounded small and vicious. People shifted. The recording tied him to attempts to influence witnesses. It was not cinematic, it was effective. A compliance officer rose and announced, voice steady, "We will cooperate fully with the investigators. There will be no obstruction." The declaration was designed both to protect the board and to signal a change of tides. Cameras fed the room to the networks. Breaking, prosecutor's office serves subpoenas. Social feeds ignited like dry tinder. For a second, Ethan felt the kinetic energy of his choices pile upon his chest. The necklace, weightless on his palm, now had the gravity of a test. He looked to Bella, to Mei Chen, to Edward, and finally to his grandfather, who sat at the edge of the ballroom like some stern, archaic god. His grandfather's face was unreadable. Ethan stepped down from the stage not as a man who had staged an act, but as a man called to account. He made a decision in the white heat of that calling. He would not obstruct the investigation. He would sign a statement agreeing to an independent audit and would relinquish executive authority while the legal process continued. Whether he meant it fully or only because the world forced him to, the decision altered the ledger of his life. The prosecutor's office announced the arrests quietly but with unstoppable clarity. Alan Yan was taken into custody on charges related to witness intimidation and alleged bribery. A mid-level accountant named Gao, who had been the linchpin in many of the transfer threads, was also detained pending further inquiry.
The room, once a banquet of lights and curated smiles, felt suddenly like a courthouse antechamber. For Bella, the moment had been paradoxically public and intimate. She had refused to be trafficked by spectacle and then used the spectacle to demand accountability. She had taken a stand not to punish, but to ensure that harm had consequence and that money could not be converted into silence. After the arrests, Ethan returned to the stage to finish the sentence he had started. He read aloud, hands trembling, a prepared statement that said he would fund a restitution program, that he accepted responsibility for lapses in judgment, and that he would step away from daily operations while Triumphal instituted an independent audit. He did not say the words that would have absolved him, because absolution was not in his power to give. He asked for the right to be held to his promises. Bella watched him. Part of her wanted the moment to end with a private reconciliation, a repair that would be slow and cautious. But she also understood that to accept a necklace meant more than charity or performance. She raised a condition that made the glitter of the stones secondary. The necklace, if accepted, would be auctioned and the funds placed into a non-revocable trust that would finance restitution and support for those harmed by similar abuses. The trust would be administered by a board controlled by independent parties, lawyers, advocates, and a representative chosen by Bella. Ethan exhaled, realized the cost, and agreed. The cameras captured the exchange and would later run it as the headline of 1,000 think pieces. CEO offers $100 million necklace, wife accepts with conditions. But the truth was messier than a headline. Bella hadn't accepted out of gratitude so much as strategic ownership. She would turn spectacle into safety. The necklace, in the end, never belonged on her neck. It was photographed in insurance-lit frames and then carried to the auction house under seal, each step recorded, each legal signature appended. The auction itself was a spectacle that Ethan tried to avoid. He insisted on an open sale and transparency records, so no one could claim he had laundered public sentiment. When the hammer finally fell, the price was not the story. The structure of the trust was. The money would seed a fund to help victims of coercion, to support women's legal defense, and to sponsor independent audits of high-profile corporations where power and secrecy could thrive. Sandy Sue's role in the drama resolved in a quieter, sad way. Under questioning, she admitted to being manipulated by promises and panic. She had been offered safety and money to play a part in a narrative that would benefit others. The pregnancy rumors proved false, a result of a misinterpreted test and a rumor that had metastasized. She agreed to cooperate with the prosecutor. She did not become a villain in the classic sense. She became, in the eyes of those who watched, a woman who had made a choice under pressure and was now making another under consequence.
Alan Yan's arrest exposed a network of influence peddling that extended into social circles and into the underreported gray economy of favors. He was charged and publicly shamed. His influence withered as the legal process began to show its teeth. Gao, the accountant, would testify to a pattern of transfers that the prosecutor's team would trace methodically and without drama, like cleaning rust from machinery. Ethan's grandfather, facing the slow public erosion of the family name, retreated into a private fury that had nowhere to go. He was not a man to be easily humanized in a press cycle, but he found his own way of dealing with embarrassment. He had long believed the family's resilience would outlast scandal, and now he had to face the possibility that his empire might change its face. For Bella, the months after the gala were a morass of court dates, depositions, and media requests. But there were also small victories. The trust was funded, and its board met under conditions she had set. The restitution fund offered help to a handful of women who were unable to confront their own abusers. Bella worked with lawyers to write a charter that would prevent the money from being used as silence. She found a certain hard satisfaction in turning spectacle into structure. Ethan, facing public shaming and legal limbo, began to do what he had avoided for years: slow, painstaking work that could not be reduced to a headline. He attended counseling and, for the first time in his life, scheduled sessions not to be coached on optics, but to be taught how to listen. He hired compliance advisors and turned his attention to mending what had been broken in the company's culture. Whether his gestures were accepted by all was not yet settled. Reparations are always negotiated in the shadow of doubt. There were consequences for the family, too. Triumphal's board demanded changes: an overhaul of governance, a more empowered compliance structure, and a rotation of senior roles to ensure independence. Edward, seeing the damage but also wanting to keep the company afloat, proposed a temporary leadership plan that would stabilize stock prices while the investigation proceeded. He played a part that blurred loyalty to family and loyalty to principle, and in doing so earned, in a small way, Bella's wary respect. John Liu's ghost, though dead, continued to be a character that shaped the story. The prosecution's findings suggested he had used the conduited shell companies to secure funds during desperate times. He had not been a mastermind so much as an opportunist entangled in a larger web. Shell companies were not criminal, but he, the accountant, was an operative. Gao, the accountant, would testify to a pattern of transfers that the prosecutor's team would trace methodically and without drama, like cleaning rust from machinery. Bella discovered, in the end, that her father's life had been less a monolith of villainy than a brittle attempt at survival, dangerous to those who trusted him, but also human in unpredictability. She did not absolve him easily. She parsed the ledger of his life with the precision of someone separating debts from defense. A quietly important scene unfolded when a small committee from the trust invited women who had been coerced into silence to speak. The room was modest, the chairs older than they looked on television. The women told stories, some short, some long, about being offered hush money, about fear, about how power had been used to silence rather than to protect. Bella listened. She had never wanted this role, but she realized the power of someone repurposing spectacle into protection. The trust's first grants went to legal fees for survivors, to funding independent audits at companies where similar abuses might be hidden, and to a small education program that helped women understand red flags in high-pressure social networks. Months later, at a hearing to determine the company's liability and to set terms for the independent audit, Ethan took the stand. He did not make grand declarations. He spoke of negligence and of failure. He read a short, unadorned apology into the record and then answered questions, plainly and without the rhetorical flourishes he had once used to charm juries and boards. His willingness to be held accountable was not a performance now. It was a step into a different kind of life, less public, less absolute. Bella watched from the gallery. She did not feel triumph so much as relief. Justice, in her experience, was rarely satisfying in a single moment. It unfolded with sources and subpoenas, with the slow unpeeling of facts that had once been wrapped in convenience. But she also felt a curious lightness, the odd buoyancy of someone who had turned the burden of spectacle into the seed of structural change. In the months that followed, the Trust's presence altered small things. At Triumphal, compliance practices were modernized. At charity events, guest lists were scrutinized. In boardrooms, the vocabulary of consent began to be less performative and more procedural. None of this was a cure. The world of leverage and reputation still had teeth. But there were fewer people hungry to use them without consequence. Sandy Sue found a quieter life after cooperating with investigators. She enrolled in a program and moved to another city under a new name. She wrote a short, public statement about choices made under pressure and about the need for accountability. The tabloids, having fed on her image, turned away as quickly as they had fed. She learned the awkward peace that comes from being let alone. For Ethan, reconciling public penance with private change was messy. He stepped down from an executive role and agreed to a period of supervised oversight. The company's stock stabilized as the audit proceeded, in part because investors appreciated the transparency. His grandfather, watching the empire bend but not break, adjusted his expectations with a slow, stiff humility. Bella's life, meanwhile, expanded in ways she had not anticipated. She took a small office for her boutique agency and began to sign clients who valued integrity over lineage. Amy, who had offered steady support earlier, became a partner and friend. Bella's audition days became a private myth she pulled out only when she needed to remind herself that she had once stood under lights without permission and asked to be seen. The necklace's auction had produced a sum large enough to do meaningful work. Bella did not keep a single stone for herself. When friends asked whether she regretted converting a spectacle into public good, she would smile and say the truth. "I turned it into something that can't be used to silence people. That is worth more than any private apology." Ethan, in private, wrote letters to people he had hurt. Some accepted his notes, others did not. He attended a few meetings with the Trust's board to see how the money was being used, a small, humble act that felt like an attempt at restitution. He never again imagined that flashy gestures could substitute for sustained work. There was no fairy tale reconciliation in the immediate sense. Divorce proceedings continued, lawyers cut through the bureaucratic mess of settlements, and the legal system did what it is designed to do: reassign property, set agreements, and sometimes administer consequence in ways that feel insufficient. But Bella's final decision about their relationship was not placed in a courthouse only. It was made in a quieter room months later when Ethan, honest and smaller than before, asked if she could imagine them walking into a life where he would not be the axis of her world. She listened and said, "If you want repair, I will watch it happen, but I will not be its currency." They did not remarry. They did not resume a life of shared prestige. They negotiated boundaries that were legal and emotional. He continued to rebuild, she continued to build her own life. The trust became a legacy she could accept as public good rather than private penance. It was the fulcrum she needed to turn spectacle into safety. In the years that followed, Bella's name appeared in quieter profiles. An executive who had refused to be commodified and who had used an impossible moment to create structure for others. Ethan's name appeared in chronicles about accountability in corporate leadership. The necklace, once a thing meant to dazzle and to heal, had been broken down into a capital structure that would fund clinics, legal defense funds, and education programs. The money had stopped being an instrument of silence and had become a tool to prevent more silence. On an ordinary afternoon, Bella walked through the Trust's office and saw a small plaque with names of grant recipients. She felt no triumph in the plaques. She felt something like completion, an event reconfigured into purpose. She had filed for divorce once because she refused to be anyone's afterthought. She had watched a man try to buy back what he had never properly held. She had turned that attempt into a mechanism that changed how people around them would be protected.
Ethan, from a quieter suite, watched a documentary about corporate reform and saw, in a small frame, footage from the night he had offered the necklace. He flinched at the memory of the stones gleaming, and then, surprisingly, felt gratitude for what he had been forced to face. He had been spared nothing. The cost had been humiliation, stewardship, and the slow work of being accountable. It had also been a re-education in how to live in a world where power is not assumed to be a fix. Bella did not believe money bought redemption. She had seen how easily cash could be converted into coercion, but she also believed in the strange possibility that money redirected could fund safety that gifts could never buy. The necklace had been a catalyst. It had also been a mirror. What mattered was what people did after the flash. Months after the gala, when journalists called to ask whether she had won the fight, she answered simply, "I didn't want to win. I wanted to be free." The sentence was not a dismissal of the truth that the necklace had been dramatic. It was an insistence on what mattered. She refused to let the story be reduced to a spectacle of acquisition. It had been a test of agency, and she had used it to make structures that would protect others. In the quiet that followed, Bella occasionally thought of her father, the man who had told her not to be defenseless. She had not wanted to be his echo. She had wanted to be his correction. She had honored his warning in the only way she could, by refusing to be owned and by using the power at hand to ensure others couldn't be either. Ethan tried to be better. He would fail many times, imperfect people do, but the legal and social scaffolding around him made failure no longer cost-free. That was the point Bella had insisted on. Change must be more than performance. It had to be enforced, transparent, and accountable. They had both been changed by the necklace. One man learning humility and the cost of spectacle, one woman learning how to turn an attempted bribe into a tool for justice. The city, which loved bright stories, had taken note and then moved on. But for a handful of people whose lives had once been a ledger of debts and fear, change arrived in the form of lawyers paid for, clinics opened, and a public example that would be cited when other bargains turned too far toward silence.
Sometimes, walking past the charity events where glinting jewelry still caught the light, Bella would think about the day she refused to accept a $2 million apology and then stood before 100 cameras and demanded better. She likes to imagine the necklace not on her neck, but as seed money planted in earth with roots. Ethan's attempt to win her back with a $100 million necklace had failed in the way he intended, but in its failure, it had become a lever for transformation. The spectacle had mattered because she had not allowed it to be the last word. She had prescribed terms, insisted on accountability, and forced an industry into conversation about how power could be checked. If you wanted the tidy romance where a gem could buy a heart, this was not that story. If you wanted the story where spectacle remained spectacle, this was not that either. What unfolded was a slow, bureaucratic, human thing. A man confronted, a woman choosing terms, laws being enforced, and a jewelry box converted into a trust that would pay for a different kind of safety. The cameras moved on. The trust's office had more names on its list. Bella ran a small meeting and then stepped outside into a cool day, the city a grid of possible futures. She breathed in, and for the first time in years, the breath that came out felt like something she had earned on her own terms. If you want the follow-up on how the legal processes ended and what happened to everyone involved, subscribe and watch the next story.